Hi, welcome to today's webinar, Longitude, View the Health of Your Applications, Systems, and Network all from a single pane of glass. This is Ken Leone, and my contact information, as you can see, is in the lower left-hand corner of the slide deck. And I'll be presenting today's webinar. I'm going to try to keep this to half an hour. And without further ado, I have two, maybe three slides, and then we're going to jump right into Longitude. So let's get started here. So the challenge that we all have is really how to effectively monitor health and availability. Now, there are a number of challenges, both technical and economic. From a technical perspective, you know, our IT infrastructures are composed of multiple layers, and they're getting more and more complex, especially with organizations running, you know, hybrid cloud infrastructures. Crossing those boundaries is a non-trivial task. So whether you're running a private, public, or hybrid cloud, strictly a virtual infrastructure, even a physical infrastructure, or obviously if you're involved with the network, monitoring it all is a particularly challenging experience. And you really can't separate the application monitoring from the IT infrastructure. They all march in lockstep, rather. You know, the biggest challenge that a lot of people are running into is really the economic challenge and tool sprawl, increased licensing and annual support costs. I mean, you got to monitor and manage all this. You know, how many tools does an organization need? And there are a number of costs to that. For example, if there is a problem and you have multiple tools in your tool bag, you know, which one do you use? Where do you look? When you add new resources, what do you use to set up, to monitor what? So that's a lot of time and effort in terms of administration. And, you know, again, where do you look? So that requires looking in a number of places for problems. So how does Longitude help? Well, Longitude is software that monitors across boundaries. So Longitude can monitor both your internal on-prem as well as your cloud infrastructure and put it all together for you. Longitude can monitor your virtual infrastructure or your physical infrastructure, and it monitors both performance and availability for a broad scope of operating systems, both physical and virtual, network, and application components. Now, when Longitude monitors, what it does is it provides to you a real-time display to show you what's going on. So there's displays, there's dashboards that present that critical information with a drill-down capability, so you can see exactly what's going on from a performance perspective, from a health perspective, from availability perspective. Now, you may not be looking at a dashboard on a continuous basis or have something up on a panel screen or whatever. So Longitude also provides an extensive alerting capability, and it'll basically hunt you down. So email, SMS to your mobile device, integration with other technologies via SNMP. You can even tell Longitude to go out there and script a corrective action to mitigate or avoid the problem to begin with. So you can be very proactive with the technology. Now, there's a wealth of information that Longitude collects, so it's really important that you have that at your beck and call. So anytime Longitude determines that there's a problem, it alerts you. Those alerts are reportable. So if you need to determine how persistent the problem was, how many problems occurred on a given time frame, Longitude provides that for you. And all these wonderful performance metrics that the technology is collecting are available for reporting and capacity planning. Those reports can be generated automatically, and they can be published in the Longitude portal or emailed or even exported to your own portal. For example, for you SharePoint users, you can have Longitude export the reports to SharePoint. So all this information is available for IT staff, for management, and end users. Okay, so everything Longitude does, it does agentlessly. So this diagram really shows the crux of Longitude. So the software is typically deployed on a VM, a Windows VM. The software comes with everything it needs in order to function. So all you need to do is run the installation. Longitude comes with its own back-end database, its own web server, literally even its own email server. And everything the technology does, it does agentlessly. So at the bottom of the slide deck, you can see, for example, for Windows, the technology will use WMI, and for Unix it'll use SSH. So there's a broad knowledge base that Longitude comes with, and everything it gets agentlessly. In its simplest incarnation, Longitude will use a variety of protocols, whether it's again WMI for Windows or PowerShell for Exchange, or the native APIs for things like vSphere or Hyper-V, and it rolls all that information up into the Longitude server. The server then processes that information and can generate alerts, again, dashboard displays, reports, etc. Now, earlier I mentioned something about a cloud. When you're running multiple data centers, multiple locations, or cloud infrastructure, what you can do is you can deploy what's called a Longitude statistics server. You can think of it as a proxy of sorts. And what it's going to do is it's going to gather all that data at the remote location and bring it back to the Longitude server for consumption. You only need to put it on one device. So if you're running AWS or Azure or Google or whatever, what you'll do is you'll put a small piece of Longitude on one of the VMs up there. It'll gather all the data from within that cloud infrastructure and roll it up into the Longitude server. So I promised to keep the slide deck short. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into Longitude. Okay, so earlier I talked about how everything Longitude does, it does agentlessly. So I'm going to start there first and show you how you configure Longitude to go out there and monitor things agentlessly. So we'll start with something simple, like I can tell the technology to perform a discovery, and I can tell it where I want it to discover. Now, in this instance, I can tell it to discover my local Windows servers. I also have the ability to tell it to reach out to my EC2 or my AWS infrastructure as well. For now, we're just going to stick to my local infrastructure. I'll click on Next, and the technology is going to do a discovery, and it found a server called Windows 10. I click on Next, and that's it. The technology knows what it needs to monitor and how often it needs to monitor it. If I go to my list of computers here, you'll see now that Windows 10 is in my list. And in fact, we are monitoring Windows on that server already. And you can see we're getting all different kinds of metrics, classes of metrics. Longitude is a very simple and easy to understand interface. I can just go to a server, for example, and monitor other things. So I could say I want to monitor something else on that Windows server. And the technology says, well, what do you want to monitor? Do you want to monitor Active Directory? Is it running DHCP? This instance of Longitude is configured to monitor a number of instances of Exchange and SQL, etc. I'm going to keep it simple and say I just want to get Windows event log data. Click on Monitor, and again, I'm off to the races. It's quick, it's easy, and it's neat. Let's say I look at Windows 10, for whatever reasons I don't want to monitor it, I can just remove it from the list and tell the technology not to bother monitoring. Now, earlier I mentioned that you can tell Longitude to go out there and consolidate everything from your cloud, right? So I can go to Monitor, for example, and I could say, hey, listen, I want to monitor something out in my EC2. And I can just pick a Windows server from my EC2. I could do a discovery as well. I'm just going to do Windows, and I think I already have it in my list here. I'll save myself some typing here. There it is. So this is a Windows server up in my EC2. Click on Monitor, and now the technology's out there, and it's going to configure itself, and it's now monitoring that Windows server. Okay, so it's quick, it's easy, and it's neat. Everything we do agentlessly with the technology. Okay, so let's segue over to the next thing. So I've configured Longitude. It's out there monitoring. It's figuring out what's going on. I want to see what it found and perhaps alter Longitude settings. So I'm going to go from my monitoring tab to my dashboard. And there are a number of menus within the dashboard. I can get a real-time status display. I can look at my events, which I'll show you, and I can also configure Longitude's behavior. So I have a number of dashboards that I've created. These are really easy to create, and they're covered in more detail. If you go to heroix.com in the videos, you'll see that there are some links there that show you how to set up these dashboards. But here I just want to see what's the health of my Hyper-V infrastructure, and you can see I've got some issues there. Here I can actually see I've got a drive that's having a problem. So it gives me a nice visual representation of what's going on. Okay, if I want to look at the health of my VMware infrastructure, I can see, for example, that I have 3 hosts. 2 of them are having a problem, and 1 of them is okay for memory issues. I'll click on All, and you can see that these 2 hosts, based on the current knowledge base or the settings of the current knowledge base, are having problems related to to memory. Okay, so let's say I want to look at the health of my AWS infrastructure. I can just click on this little dashboard here and I can see everything is good, no problems. I want to look at the health of my Azure servers. Oh, I see I have an issue. So I have some file systems here. It's a Unix server that's having an issue. So I'm going to click on all here. And you can see in this instance that what Longitude did is it consolidated what was going on up on Azure, and in this instance we found a file system that was having a problem. In this instance I just have one VM there out in the on the Azure cloud there. Okay, if I wanted to look at what's happening on-prem, I can just click on my dashboard here and see what's happening on-prem. Okay, and again I can drill down. So here I have some disks that are problematic based on free space. Okay, now I can also not only look at my infrastructure, be it virtual, be it physical, be it local, be it in the cloud, be it in a hybrid environment. I can also look at my network. Again, everything is good here right now. Or I can also look at a combination of the health of the infrastructure and the applications itself. So I have a group of servers that I've put all together here. It's Test Lab and it's ERP. And here I have no unreachable servers. Everything is good. I have a server that has a CPU problem. So I'm monitoring. In this instance for ERP, I have 23 servers that are okay and one that's problematic. And again, I can drill and see who the problematic server is. In addition to looking at the health of the infrastructure, I can also look at the health of the application components. So for example here, I can look at the health of my SQL buffer cache, the SQL logs. Do I have any indexing problems? Do I have any latch problems? And actually I can just, for example, just right click here and show all, and I can see what my cache, they're very healthy for both these database instances. They're 100%. So these widgets, if you will, allow you to see in a clear and concise way what the health of your application and your infrastructure components are. I'm actually looking at Unix. Do I have any runnable processes? And you can see here that Longitude's complaining about some runnable processes. Okay, so I have 5 runnable processes on the left, and I also have some on Unix 2 as well. Okay, so I get a nice clear picture of what's going on. Okay, now if I want something a bit more clinical, and maybe I want to affect the knowledge base, what I'm going to do is instead of clicking on status, I'm going to go to events. Now I can group my events based on any criteria that I want. So for example here, these are just all my events for all my devices. And I can say, show me only the ones that are problematic. I can zero in on a specific device. So for example, I can look at that, remember that, that Azure instance where we had a file system issue? So here's Longitude identifying the file system that's having a problem. I can look at it based on application. So I can go to applications and I can say, hey, Longitude, show me all my VMware problems. So I have a couple of hosts with some memory issues. Okay, or show me just what's happening in my Windows servers. So these are my Windows server problems. Here I have a disk queue length problem on my SQL 2016 server. Is a drive with a queue depth of 30. Or maybe I want to look at my Windows event log or something like that. I can also group my devices together, and devices can be in multiple groups. And I've set this up, for example, so I can look at the health of my AWS infrastructure. It's green, life is good. And maybe I want to look at just what's happening in Azure. And again, I can see that one file system that's having a problem in Azure. Or maybe I want to look at the health of what's happening on-prem. Okay, so I can see what I have on-prem here. And I have all kinds of issues. Or maybe I grouped everything together per the previous display. I have a grouping called Test Lab. Okay, and it's my ERP servers. So again, you can group these any way you want. Each user can set up a view that's unique to them. Views can be either global or they can be local. So you can really tailor the technology to display what you want the way you want it. Longitude also has role-based security, so you can control who has access to the technology, and once they're in there, the kind of access that they in fact do have. Okay, so here's another instance of a dashboard that's configurable. These are the problems that Longitude has discovered. If I want to see, did I get any Windows events? So here's some Windows events that are coming in that I need to know about. Do I have any SNMP traps coming in? I got some traps coming in. And we also have some service levels, and you can see here that they've gone from from worsened to from good to degraded. So I had an SLA that was okay, and then I went to degraded, and then degraded to unacceptable. And we'll get into SLAs in a few minutes. But let's go back to my application events here. So these are the problems that that Longitude's going to find. So let's go to let's go to applications, and we can look at Windows. So there's all my Windows problems. I'm going to go back to groups for a moment here and look at just my test lab. Okay, so what I have here is a mix. So you can see I have in my test environment, for example, I have a process that's eating a lot of resources on a server. So Windows 5.test has a process called CPU stress, and you can see that it's eating up 55% of the CPU. If I don't want to look at the display, I can click on the configure button here, and I can configure Longitude's behavior. So there's a couple things I can do. For example, my threshold is anybody that's using more than 30% of the CPU is a problem. I can change that globally to be a different value, or you'll notice that when I clicked on that event, Longitude selected that server. So if for that one server I wanted to have a different value of 40%, I could override that value. So you have the ability to quickly and easily affect the Longitude knowledge base. I'm not going to be here staring at this display all the time, so I can also tell Longitude to respond to that problem by telling it to take an action. And I'll start with something simple where what I want Longitude to do is send me an email, and what I'll do is I'll have it email me only if the problem's really persistent. So let's say it has to happen 3 times in a row, and only email me on Saturdays and Sundays. And maybe I just want to do it between the hours of 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. or something like that. So I'll just do 8 a.m. and to 5 p.m. So you have a lot of control here. Click apply, and I've now set up an action. I could add another action. I could do something different, for example. Now, once I'm in here, this is the currently active knowledge base. So this is what this instance of Longitude is currently monitoring, okay? So for example, it zeroed in on a Windows problem that was a CPU problem, but I could go and say, well, I want the technology to handle any service problems if a service is down. And what you'll see here, for example, is when I go to the service down, that I've already have an action set up for a specific group of servers. I said, listen, if the service is down, I want you to email me, and then I want Longitude to execute a command. So I'm having Longitude execute a net start command, and there's help here that tells you what everything is. But basically, the measured object is in this instance is the name of the service that happens to be down. Okay, so what Longitude, I don't have to hard code the name of the service. We'll just substitute it as an argument. So in this instance, Longitude says, okay, I want to restart the service, and I have a second action that says, listen, for any servers that are in my production environment, any services that are in these 2 SQL services, what I'd like the technology to do is if the service is down for 2 consecutive intervals, I'd like the technology to go out there and SMS my phone. So I just gave it the provider and a phone number, and then just leave me alone for a little while. Okay. Again, you can see the knowledge base has a consistent look and feel. So if I go to Windows CPU and look at busy CPU percentage and click on my threshold here, what you'll see here is how easy it is for me to set thresholds. Right. So here I have a Windows server. It's an EC2, and for that server, I want to set a value of 90 for my CPU busy. That's all I have to do. If I go to my VMware here and pick CPU, you see it has the same look, same feel. This is for hosts. If I care about VMs, I can look at my VMs as well. Very constant look and feel on it. Okay, so I showed you a little bit about how you can configure events when there's a problem. So you can configure the thresholds and you can configure the actions. And typically this is a display that a lot of my users tend to look at. Some of the other people, some of my other cohorts tend to gravitate towards the status dashboard. It's really going to be up to you. But you can see here, these are all the problems. In the real world, this display should be pretty much empty. But for test purposes, we obviously wanted to expose you to a little bit of some of the capabilities of Longitude. Okay, so let's segue over to SLAs for a moment here. So service level agreements allow you to aggregate key metrics together. So I created an SLA, and again, this is covered in another video, where I'm just looking at database response time within the context of uptime of the resources. And you can see here that nothing's gone down for my my application here that I've created, but I am looking at response time, and I have Longitude querying the database, and if it takes longer than 25 milliseconds, that's considered to be degraded, and longer than 50 milliseconds, and that's considered to be unacceptable. And I can see when something went degraded and when it went unacceptable. And I can also graph it. So here's what's cool about SLAs. So I'm going to go to my application availability SLA. This is something I just fired up fairly recently. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at web response time, so Longitude synthetically navigating a web page. I'm looking at the health of VMware, of SQL, of the network, of IIS, database response time, and just availability. Now, again, I'm stacking all my metrics here. It could be any set of metrics. They could be metrics coming from your on-prem or up in the cloud. And I can see, for example, that I do, in fact, have some response time issues while I'm synthetically navigating the web page. And in fact, I can graph that. And I can also see that I have some problems related to a SQL server with a deep processor queue length. So anything greater than 3 is degraded, and greater than 6 is unacceptable. And you can see that I've been in an unacceptable state, and I could drill down and get more detail in that regard as well. So SLAs are really powerful. Again, they allow you to really stack a lot of metrics together and set thresholds for good, degraded, unacceptable. And again, this is a real-time display, and this information is also available to you in reports as well. Okay, so let's go over to reports. So in the original slide deck, I talked about reporting, and I said, hey, you know, Longitude can report on alerts and it can report on performance. So everything that Longitude collects, all the information it generates, gets written into the Longitude database. If it's in the database, it's reportable. So I'm going to tell Longitude, for example, report on Windows events. And I can do it for all my servers. Remember how we had those groups? Let's say I just want to report on what happened in my test lab environment, okay? And what Longitude did is I identified, well, I've got some failure audits coming in on Windows 5 and Windows 15. I'll just drill here and get a little bit more detail. And I can see when those events occurred, okay? And if I want to actually look at the failure audits, I can click here. So here's a failure audit that's getting generated over and over and over again, okay? We saw alerts in the Longitude event display, so I can report on those alerts. So I go to application events. I'm going to go back to groups for a moment here, look at test lab, and I can see what servers were problematic. Let's look at Windows 5. We can see we had some major problems. We'll click on the major button, and remember we saw that alert about the CPU stress running on the server, and I can see all the times that that event is being generated. So this is a problem certainly that's not going away. If I want to get a performance report, let's start with, we'll do a VMware one. We'll just do a standard report here. And let's just report on, we'll do the enterprise here. Now the concepts I'm showing here have applicability whether you're reporting on Windows, Unix, Linux, VMware, whatever. It's all your network, SQL, Exchange, it all looks the same. So what I can do is, oh, this is a nice report. I want to drill and get a little bit more detail. I can drill and get a little bit more detail here. Okay, I can change the date and time. Longitude keeps a year's worth of data online. I can just change the criteria there. If I want to schedule this report, I can schedule it. I can tell it to run daily, hourly, weekly, monthly, quarterly. I can have that report emailed to me. I can export it for consumption in SharePoint or any other application. It'll just export an XHTML file. Okay. When I schedule the report, they get published in Longitude. So these are reports that have already been run. And for example, I can see here what's going on. Let me find a report here. Yeah, let's look at this guy. So here we have a host. And these are, that's the capacity, 18 gig. And this is the CPU footprint of each of the VMs on the host. So these reports can be batched and then just sent for consumption to, again, inside Longitude or elsewhere. Okay, so anytime you run a report, let's look at a different report here. Let's go to, sure, let's look at a Windows report. And I'll just run it at the enterprise. Anytime you look at a report, you can look at the data, or you can look at the graph. If I go back, let's go back a few days and see what's going on here. And let's look at SQL 12 here. So I'm drilling and getting more detail, and you can see it really spiked, and then it settled down. So I had a really high load, and then everything settled down afterwards. I can pick SQL 2016, see what's going on that server. Now, what I can also do is change the graph to go from a detailed graph to what's called an hourly summary. So if I want to see what the average is per hour, so if you had like a situation where you had a bell curve, it would look, you would be able to see that there as well. So really nice reporting capability. The last thing I want to show you is the capacity planner that's built into Longitude. So let's look at the VMware capacity planner. So I'm running this in a test lab right now. And this is the environment. Actually, let's look at this one here. And we'll go to Heroix test. It's one host, really simple. And let's go back to a graph. Instead of an hourly, we'll go to a timeline. And you can see here what my usage has been from the 6th to the 10th. So these are my VMs. This is my capacity, and I can see what's been going on. And I can look at it from a memory perspective and a disk perspective and a network perspective, et cetera. So let's go back to CPU. Now, so here's where it gets kind of interesting. So what I can do is I can create a scenario called scenario 1. And I'm going to run it. Now you look at it, it's a twin, right? It looks exactly the same as the one above, right? So if I run that same report, looks exactly the same. Now what I can do is I can do a what if capability. So let's clone, I don't know, we'll do 15 instances of a VM called Croatia. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell Longitude, well, what happens if I add 15 more instances of a VM that has this kind of footprint on this host? What's that going to look like? So Longitude is going to build it out for me and tell me if I have enough capacity to push it. And you can see, obviously, I don't, because I have 18 gig of CPU and I'm up around 21 gigs. So I have a couple of options here. I can go to properties here and I can say, well, what happens if I double up on the CPU? What's that going to look like? Okay, I have enough room. Now, I may want to instead add another host. So I'm going to clone this host. I'll just leave it with the default name here. And then what I can do is I can take some of these VMs and move them over here and see what that looks like. So you get some really cool stuff with the technology. So on the reporting side, to summarize, you can report on the events or the alerts, depending on the terminology you want to use. You can report on the Windows events. If you had syslog, you can report on syslog events, and you can report on performance. That performance, all the performance reports, all the events reports can be generated and batched up, and they can be emailed to people, or they can be scheduled in the Longitude portal. Again, once you've done your monitoring, most of the time is going to be spent in the dashboard. And this is where you can see exactly what's going on. Longitude, in summary, is going to scan both the local infrastructure as well as any remote data centers, as well as your infrastructure that's up in the cloud. Again, you deploy what's called a Longitude remote agent. So I promised to keep this to about a half an hour, which is, I think, what I've done. I'm going to put some contact information up here. If you have questions or if there's anything else we can do, please either email me at ken.leone@heroix.com, or you're welcome to visit us at Heroix. That's heroix.com. Thank you for attending, and everybody have a wonderful day.